Whilst tonight's presentation is about a single war cemetery in Singapore, which you can see here at its unveiling on the 2nd of March, 1957, my intention is to highlight the many considerations and so-called hidden hands that went into its development. This is because war cemeteries are often viewed through the stories of the servicemen and women that are buried and commemorated within them, and the annual ceremonies that take place around important occasions. I want to show how in the case of Kranji, there is a larger narrative and how it's part of a wider post-war endeavour across Asia. At the same time, I'm taking this opportunity to highlight the many cemeteries and burial grounds in Singapore that contributed to founding Kranji, most of which have now vanished through redevelopment, and the knock-on effect to local history and culture. Kranji is in fact an amalgamation of many of Singapore's former cemeteries. So I've therefore arranged my talk this evening in 4 parts. Firstly, to briefly explain the conditions and events that led to a war cemetery being required in Singapore. Secondly, to highlight the many participants and decisions as to why Kranji was selected and the many other sites that went into its initial creation. Thirdly, to introduce its architect, how Kranji was conceived and then constructed. And finally, its legacy, what it means and offers to a contemporary Singapore. So on the 8th of December 1941, a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese 25th Army with air and naval forces under the command of Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita invaded northern Malaya. Around the same time, Japanese forces pushed into the Philippines, Indonesia, Borneo, New Guinea, and the Southwest Pacific. They also pushed northwards through Thailand to occupy Burma on their way into northeast India. Contrary to many perceptions, British forces had considered the threat to Singapore from the north, and the Public Works Department had constructed numerous airfields and military bases throughout Malaya. What had not occurred was these bases suitably reinforced with modern aircraft and weapons. This is attributed to more pressing needs closer to the UK at the time. As late as 1939, for example, the Royal Air Force had no fighter aircraft stationed in the Far East. What planes they had were older variants and no match for Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros. And you'll see why this is important to the story later on. It was only in middle of January 1942 that British-built Hurricane fighters were delivered to Singapore, but even then in small numbers, and they had not been modified for tropical conditions. The Japanese Imperial Army, now attacking on either side of the peninsula, with the numerically greater armoured tanks, superior aircraft, and naval assets, put Commonwealth forces onto a defensive retreat southwards. Furthermore, on the 10th of December, the sinking of 2 of Britain's flagship vessels, the battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse, made holding Malaya untenable. On the 31st of January 1942, almost 8 weeks after the initial invasion, all remaining British, Australian, Indian, and local forces crossed the causeway linking Singapore, and this land bridge was blown. A few weeks later, on the 8th of February, 1942, Japanese forces launched their assault on Singapore itself. They crossed the Johor Straits and landed to the northwest, including along the Kranji coastline. Yamashita, from the tower of the Sultan of Johor's palace just across the water, was able to observe his forces advance. Over the next few days, amidst ferocious battles and hundreds of casualties to both sides, Japanese forces pushed south and east, advancing to the edges of the city. On the 15th of February, 7 days after the assault, Far East Command's Lieutenant General Arthur Percival unconditionally surrendered. Over 130,000 Commonwealth and local troops became prisoners of war in camps including the notorious Changi. Over the next 3 years, many of these prisoners were sent to the Thai-Burma Railway, where thousands died under appalling conditions. Others were shipped to Taiwan, Japan, and other Japanese outposts, with many dying when Allied submarines mistakenly attacked them. Hundreds of prisoners would die of disease and malnourishment in the camps themselves. For example, of the 15,000 Australian servicemen who surrendered, approximately 7,000 would die as prisoners of war. That's 46%. There were also the thousands of local Chinese civilians massacred under the Suk Chin Purge. Singapore became awash with cemeteries, burial grounds, and sites of mass graves, many of which would only be discovered years later. So with the end of the war in Asia, the Imperial War Graves Commission, as it was known then, was tasked to establish war cemeteries and memorials for a vast region spanning from northeast India to Singapore in the south and Hong Kong in the Far East. Colin St. Clair Oakes, a veteran of the Burma campaign, was appointed principal architect to design the major sites in Asia, becoming the Commission's only principal architect of the recent war. These sites, as you can see on this diagram, on this map, and now almost 80 years since the fall of Singapore, provide us a physical reminder of Imperial Japan's military advances during the war. They also remind us of each location's dark history and provide a lasting testimony to the events of that period. So each of the war cemeteries seen here, designed by Oakes himself, reflect the traumatic history of their location. For example, in the case of Kohima and Imphal, they were scenes of significant battles. Or in the case of Than Bir Zayet and Kanchanaburi, which are at either ends of the Thai-Burma Railway, they reflect the horrific treatment of prisoners of war and civilians alike. The Battle of Singapore was always going to require a dedicated war cemetery. But why was there a need for a significant memorial? Atop a small hill overlooking the Straits of Johor and Malaysia to the north, the Singapore Memorial has often been described as resembling an aircraft. This was no aberration. Unlike the First World War, the Second had seen an unprecedented expansion of the air forces of the Commonwealth, along with an unprecedented number of air casualties, many of whom could not be recovered. And like naval memorials erected in the past, honouring those with no known grave, the War Graves Commission determined there should also be dedicated memorials honouring the fallen airmen and women. The final decision was that 4 Air Force memorials would be erected spanning the entire theatre of the Second World War. Runnymede, just outside Greater London, was chosen for those air operations originating from the United Kingdom, North and Western Europe. Designed by Sir Edward Morph, its 2-story shrine evokes a similarity to control towers guiding aircrew home. The Malta Memorial in Valletta, designed by Sir Hubert Worthington, was for the campaign around the Mediterranean. It is a tall, slender column topped with a bronze eagle on a ball, symbolic of flight and courage. Alamein Memorial in Egypt was dedicated for Southeastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Also designed by Worthington, its 3 grand arches within a vast entrance wall are suggestive of airfield bunkers and hangars. The 4th memorial was to be erected in Singapore to represent the air campaign for all of Asia, with only where in Singapore to be confirmed. On January the 6th, 1946, the Commission's Inspector for India and Burma, Colonel Harry Obard, Deputy Director of Works Major Andrew McFarlane, and a recently demobilised Major Colin St. Clair Oakes arrived in Singapore. By this stage, they were 2 months into a 26,000-mile journey across Asia, visiting most of the military cemeteries and burial grounds in India, Burma, Thailand, Malaya, and Ceylon. Their instructions were to firstly decide upon the permanent sites for war cemeteries, and secondly, Oakes, as the Commission's advisory architect at this stage, would sketch up preliminary proposals which were issued to the Army War Graves units to guide their burial layouts. This was to avoid having to exhume and reinter remains once again to suit final design schemes. In Singapore, they met two important figures: Colonel Eric Foster Hall of the British Army's Directorate Graves Registration and Inquiries Unit, and Lieutenant Colonel Athol Brown of the Australian War Graves Services. Foster Hall had just come from the Thai-Burma Railway, where he had been overseeing the British Army's recovery efforts along the entire length. After Oak's recent visit there, they had begun the consolidation of remains into the three major burial grounds at Than Bue Zayet, Kanchanaburi, and Changkai. Brown, on the other hand, had been dispatched from Australia the previous day on account of the Australian government's sensitivity regarding their prisoners of war. Brown at the time was overseeing a parallel campaign of recovery efforts and planning for war cemeteries within what I call the Australian sphere of operations. Places such as Borneo, Sulawesi, Ambon, New Guinea, and the Southwest Pacific. And after a joint UK-Australian war graves meeting held soon after they all arrived in downtown Singapore, Brown would take responsibility on behalf of Australia for Commonwealth war graves in Japan. Over the next few days, accompanied by representatives of Headquarters Far East Land Forces and Supreme Allied Command, this party would visit the sites of 7 former prisoner of war and military burial grounds across the island. These were located at Bona Vista, Melaik, Nee Soon, Wing Lung, Changi, Point 348, and Kranji. Each of these sites were quite unique. With their own traumatic history and post-war Oakes and Obard would examine and evaluate each site on its merits and disadvantages and report back to the Commission their findings, which I will share in the next few slides. Bona Vista, otherwise known at the time as Dover Road Military Cemetery, later to be known as Pasipanjang. The most western of the sites, this area was the scene of the final bloody battle of the Malayan campaign and is arguably Singapore's most significant battlefield. Defended by the Malay Regiment with hand-to-hand fighting throughout the jungles and along the ridges, its eventual capture allowed the Japanese unchallenged access through to Alexandra Hospital, scene of one of the island's most infamous massacres. Described as a landscape of blasted trees but carpeted by the many wildflowers of the tropics, the poor condition of the soils would rule this site out. This cemetery, which accommodated many of the casualties from the recent battle and had also served the local army camps prior to the war, would be closed in the early 1970s for redevelopment. Its remains were exhumed and, along with Ulu Pandan Military Cemetery, which is further north, relocated to the newly constructed Kranji Military Cemetery, adjacent the war cemetery. Melaik, this is, it's from the Malay word Melaka, meaning a rubber tree farm or plantation. It's actually a burial ground on the site of the former mental asylum and leper settlement. It was a small cemetery established by Allied prisoners of war camped outside the former mental asylum and adjacent leper settlement. Japanese forces had commandeered these institutions and turned them into a civilian and military hospital, which received the seriously wounded patients from the General Civil Hospital. In one of the saddest episodes of the war, the Japanese transferred 500 of the asylum's mentally ill patients to St. John's Island off the south coast of Singapore, where many starved to death. Those who remained were locked up and neglected. Nee Soon. On the outskirts of Kampong Pengkalan Petai, a small waterfront village encircled by petai, which is a particular a bitter bean plant, pineapple and rubber plantations, the Nee Soon cemetery was the most difficult to research and in fact identify, given that to this day it is in a restricted area with access prohibited. On sloping ground facing the Seletar River estuary, it was only through Oakes and Obard's reports and the records of a specific war crimes trial that I was able to roughly identify the likely site. It had served those who died in the nearby Nisun and Dieppe barracks, which became prisoner of war camps. But what is most interesting about this cemetery is that it comprised two Muslim burial grounds separated by a track, with one of them solely for the Joranyu, which is one of the distinct original tribes of Singapore Island. And it highlights the social distinctions within the Malay communities at the time. According to the war crimes trials, Nisun's dark history involved the Japanese execution of captured American aircrew late in the war and their burial there. Soon after the Japanese surrender, a decision was made to exhume these men and burn the remains in an attempt to suppress and destroy all evidence of the executions. Its limited access, surrounding plantations, and proximity to the nearby Seletar Air Base would eventually preclude this site as the main war cemetery. But given the number of Muslim burials here, Oakes and Obard had in fact recommended that they remain undisturbed and to become Singapore's second official war cemetery, only for Muslim servicemen. Wing Lung, otherwise known as Changi British Prisoner of War Cemetery. At the eastern end of Singapore, off Wing Lung Road and past existing Chinese, Muslim, and Indian burial grounds serving the local settlements. This cemetery, with what Oakes described as having commanding views over the Straits of Singapore, was laid out on the flat grounds of a former Boy Scout camp, the Purdy Camp. It was the second of the Changi Prisoner of War cemeteries, with its layout designed by Major Edward Harper of the Royal Engineers, himself a prisoner of war at Changi. By the end of the war, it accommodated the remains of 581 British and Dutch prisoners of war and civilians who died whilst at Changi. The cemetery also had a lich gate at its entrance. It was designed by former architect Captain Cecil Pickersgill and built by men from the 18th Division. This lich gate became a very symbolic reminder of Changi, and after the war was relocated outside St. George's Church in Tangland Barracks, before being relocated to the National Memorial Arboretum outside Birmingham in the UK. A replica was provided to St. George's, which stands there today. But there was also a second replica, designed by local architecture students immediately after the war and erected outside the Kranji War Cemetery for a period. Pickersgill himself would not survive the war after returning from the Thai Burma Railway. His name is inscribed on the Singapore Memorial. The Changi Prisoner of War Cemetery, situated somewhere between Selarang and Roberts Barracks, was actually two burial grounds either side of a central entrance. The British were concentrated one end, Australians at the other. It had been carefully laid out and landscaped by Captain Jack Elliott, a former postal worker from Western Australia and a prisoner at the camp. Importantly, this was the Australian government's preferred site. This had been made patently obvious by their holding of a design competition for a memorial and cemetery immediately after liberation by its prisoners of war. The winning entry, and a sizable amount at the time of £100 prize money, was awarded to the architect Lieutenant John Brindley, who would go on to design numerous modernist public buildings across regional New South Wales. But for all its significance and at the dismay of the Australians, it had to be ruled out on account of the Royal Air Force expanding the nearby runways originally built by the Japanese during the occupation. Today's Changi Airport. Of all the sites visited, this is point 348. Of all the sites visited, the strongest case was in fact made for point 348, otherwise known as Bukit Batok Hill, the second highest in Singapore. Both Oakes and Obard, in their original reports to the Commission, would recommend this location as the site of Singapore's permanent war cemetery. This hill overlooked the former Ford Motor Factory, site of the Allies' surrender to the Japanese, and today repurposed as an important museum. Oakes had in fact envisaged a series of burial terraces around the base rising upwards, with the memorial at the summit, similar somewhat to his ideas for both Kohima and Hong Kong. His sketch proposal issued for this site has never been found. But this hill during the war was the site of a Japanese war memorial and shrine to commemorate their own war dead, known as Sionan Churieto, erected a few months after the fall of Singapore and using Australian prisoner of war labour. In fact, a small wooden cross memorial was also erected behind the main shrine to commemorate the Allied war dead. Upon the island's liberation, British Army authorities ordered its immediate demolition, with today only some steps remaining. Now, whilst the association of point 348 with this difficult history would eventually preclude its consideration, it was an interesting decision. By way of contrast, a few months later, a similar Japanese memorial, this time in Yokohama, Japan, would also be demolished by the Allies, and a military cemetery for Commonwealth servicemen erected in its place. Today, we are left pondering the what if. Which finally brings me to Kranji. In May 1944, the site of a former army barracks and ammunition dump was repurposed by Japanese forces as a hospital and prisoner of war camp to cater to the many returning casualties from the Thai-Burma Railway. The very railway line that took thousands of prisoners to this fate ran alongside the camp. With many of these returning servicemen succumbing to malnourishment and their ailments, a small cemetery was quickly set up approximately 500 yards south of the site of the camp upon a small Kranji hill. Overlooking the Straits of Johor, one of the prisoners responsible for establishing this cemetery, Samuel Purvis of the 197th Field Ambulance and a former professional footballer, described it as follows. Kranji turned out to be the worst camp of them all. Strange though it may seem, it was also the nicest in which to bury our dead colleagues. So after ruling out all the other locations through reasons such as poor soil conditions, expanding runways, complicated land tenure, and political sensitivities, it would be Kranji, north of Singapore, that would be selected for the permanent war cemetery. The War Grave Services would begin to consolidate all remains located throughout Singapore into a preliminary layout issued by Oakes, pending, of course, his final design. But unknown at the time, its design would take a back seat for 8 years, while sites in India, then Burma, and Thailand took priority. This image, as you see here, was taken in 1946, early 1946, soon after Kranji was confirmed, and it shows the temporary burial layout. To the left are the temporary camps for the number 61 Graves concentration unit and a small Japanese prisoner of war camp that provided the labor for rebuilding damaged buildings and roads and infrastructure in Singapore and the cemetery itself. The prominent hill in the background is Bukit Mandai. It wasn't just the major burial sites visited that would provide the war dead for reinterment at Kranji. Singapore by this stage had hundreds of burial grounds scattered across the island as a result of the fighting and the post-occupation treatment of civilians and prisoners. There were also many scattered and isolated graves hastily created in the final days of the war, and significantly, there were many unknown mass graves from atrocities committed to civilians and servicemen alike that would only be discovered years later. And just to give you an outline of how many cemeteries there were, a report in 1978 identified that at that time there were still 213 burial grounds comprising 2,146 hectares in Singapore, which in an island that size amounted to a 3.2% of the land area. So just to highlight a few examples in this slide, from top left, we have a prisoner of war's sketch of a small burial ground adjacent the Sime Road camp, which also included a Japanese casualty. Then there was Bidadari, one of the historic cemeteries of Singapore that accommodated war dead burials. Similar isolated war dead were found in the other significant historic cemetery in Singapore, Bukit Brown. Ulu Pandan Military Cemetery, which had both war dead and military deaths. And then there was Tan Son Nhat British War Cemetery in Saigon, which in 1954 saw the remains relocated to Kranji on account of the crisis affecting Vietnam. Another example was the mass grave at the Singapore Civil Hospital grounds, created in those frantic final days. An open water reserve trench was used by hospital staff to bury the ever-mounting dead of all nationalities being brought in amidst the fighting and the shelling, which the Japanese continued after the surrender. Lime was used and the trench backfilled over and grassed, thereafter to be forgotten. It was only rediscovered in June of 1946 when it was returned to civilian authorities and trial holes were dug. Without the ability to determine who was a serviceman and who was a civilian, it was decided to leave it undisturbed and instead provide a memorial at Kranji to those who could be identified. Only this wooden cross remains today at the hospital grounds in memory of those who lay buried there. So, who was the architect Colin St. Clair Oakes? Aware of the time limitations, I can only provide a brief outline, but I do recommend his Wikipedia page entry or the book In Honour of War Heroes for a more detailed account. Born in North Wales, his father was a country architect and First World War veteran. He went to a local county school, followed by undergraduate training at Northern Polytechnic School of Architecture. A spell in Finland followed before returning in 1931 and winning a Rome scholarship at the British School of Rome, staying there for 2 years. Back in the UK, he joins Robert Furneaux Jordan and Maxwell Allen, whilst also teaching part-time at the Architectural Association, where he gradually develops his modernist design sensibility. In 1936, he takes up an appointment as second architect to the government of Bengal, where he remains until the rumblings of war see him return and enlist. As a long-time member of the Territorial Army, a keen horseman, and his experience in Bengal, it would see him return to Asia, but this time as a captain of the Royal Artillery attached to the 72nd Indian Infantry Brigade, 36th Division, under Field Marshal William Slim. Oakes would take part in the Burma campaign. And in the Second Battle of Arakan at Enkiaduk, also known as the Battle of the Admin Box and the Maya Tunnels in March of 1944, Oakes would distinguish himself, earning an MBE in the field and being promoted to major. So between 1946 to 1955, the majority of war cemeteries in Asia would be designed and completed. In the case of Kranji, Oakes only began designing in 1953 to commemorate the approximately 3,000 Commonwealth airmen who had died in that theatre. He drew inspiration from the aircraft silhouettes often found on playing cards handed out to service personnel and used to identify friend from foe. Indeed, the monument's profile bears a striking resemblance to the wings of the British-built Hawker Hurricane, the fighter plane that ironically arrived too late to an embattled Singapore. Alongside the Spitfire, this aircraft was crucial during the Battle of Britain, but why use the lesser-known Hurricane silhouette? The research took me to Oakes' own wartime experience during the Burma campaign. As he recalled to his son years later, it was during these battles, crouched low to the ground and taking cover, that watching the Hurricanes flying overhead in support was the most reassuring presence. The design then evolved. The prolonged delays to the Commission's work across the world had seen the need for further consolidation of cemetery sites and memorials across Asia. The Singapore Memorial was expanded to accommodate thousands of army servicemen who had fallen during the campaigns in Malaya and Indonesia and had no known graves. This also included the thousands of prisoners of war who had perished on Japanese ships on their way to captivity elsewhere. There are also over 12,000 Indian servicemen accounted for on these stone tablets. The final design comprises 12 concrete spar walls supporting a winged structure which appears to float above. These walls embedded with white Portland stone slabs and lined by a fine Shanghai plaster, are inscribed with 24,319 Commonwealth service personnel who gave their lives and have no known grave. A further 4,461 headstones line the grass slopes below, of which 759 remain unknown. At its center, a tail fin-like pylon rises almost 80 feet, crowned by a glass lantern. And in an iconic reference to airmen, Oakes incorporated a light fitting within this lantern to mark the tower's height and position for inbound air traffic using the nearby Royal Air Force Base at Tenga. And on a personal note, I hope that one day some authority in Singapore organize an evening event at Kranji and that the lantern is once again illuminated. And yet this is only part of the story. For all significant structures such as Kranji, it is never a single person, but several in various capacities that each in their own way contribute to it being conceived and completed. Throughout my research, quite a few children and descendants of those many contributors came forward and offered me their stories, from the prisoners of war who dug the first graves on Kranji Hill to the officers deciding that site in Singapore. They were all able to better inform our understanding. Crucial to this group was Kranji's builder, Ho Bok Ki. Researching Ho Bok Ki provided me with insights into the local Chinese contribution to the project, which is often ignored in official histories. Ho Bok Ki's story begins prior to the war in 1929, when he arrived in Singapore as a qualified carpenter. His hometown of Hui'an in the mountains of Fujian province was the stone cutting and carving center of China, reputed for their headstones and temple sculptures that are exported throughout the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. Surviving the Japanese occupation by keeping a low profile, Ho Bok Ki would after the war be involved in repairing and rebuilding many of the former army camps and bases before expanding into larger public institutions. Whilst Kranji was his most prominent project, he also was responsible for building the much-loved former National Library at Stamford Road, the Niang Kong Si School at Balestier Road, the Singapore Broadcasting Centre at Caldecott Hill, and the Mount Vernon Crematorium, amongst others. In this advertorial, which you see on the left, which Ho Bok Ki placed in the local Nanyang Xiangpao Chinese newspaper on the day of the unveiling, he proudly highlights the use of Shanghai render, which I mentioned earlier. And for those who don't know, Shanghai plaster is a kind of granolithic cement render that emerged from Hong Kong in the mid-1920s and became one of the most popular choices for modern buildings in Asia. It also tied closely to the construction culture and movement of the Cantonese craftsmen throughout the overseas Chinese networks. Oakes used this finish also on the Siawan Memorial in Hong Kong. And on a side note, Singapore's original war memorial, the Cenotaph at the Esplanade, designed after the one at Whitehall by Swan and McLaren, was also built by a Hui'an migrant, So Ma Eng. There were many others, too many to fully recount in this talk, that all played a small part in the development of Kranji. The director of the Botanic Gardens, Professor Eric Holtom, who was interned in Singapore, advised on improving Kranji's soil quality and recommended suitable plantings for the tropics. And former governor and another fellow prisoner of war, Sir Franklin Gimson, who persuaded both the Commission and the Colonial Office to accommodate within Kranji the remains of 67 Chinese members of the Commonwealth whose military status could not be verified at the time. So as I researched Kranji, I came to understand that the war grave cemetery sites, which rarely feature in architectural scholarship, have materially rich, multi-layered histories that we need to be aware of. The Singapore Memorial needs to be recognized as an exemplar of post-war modernism in Asia. At the same time, its prominent position within Singapore and amidst a wider array of similar commemorative sites in Asia, extending into the Asia-Pacific region, allows a new narrative through architecture of reading the effects of the conflict that raged that long ago. But Kranji also offers Singapore another view of its history. Through the development of Kranji, we can see some of the many other cemeteries and burial grounds that grace the island, or with their individual heritage, most of which have now been converted to housing estates. Together with the many hidden hands that went into Kranji's creation, this rich history can be uncovered through the stories of these sites and the roles architects played in creating such sites of memory. Architects who worked for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission certainly understood this sacrifice, and their work through the ages suitably reflected the seriousness and timelessness of their designing. The war cemeteries throughout Asia, exemplified by Kranji War Cemetery and Memorial, confirm this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that enlightening and I would say also moving sharing. This is, how do I say, this has really made me think about how much more meaning there is within this memorial that could be shared with the complex and the diverse society that is in Singapore today, such that more people can understand the value of what it's trying to say, and I guess ultimately the importance of peace. Now, may I ask if there are any questions from our audience from across the Commonwealth at the moment? If you have, you can either type it in or you can raise your hand and introduce yourself very briefly and keep to a short question. So the floor is open. Well, okay, everyone's quiet and shy at the moment. Maybe I will ask the first question. It's a bit of a, maybe it's a practical issue. What made you think about looking into the newspaper archives of the other languages to try to broaden your research? Where did that idea come from?
Well, actually the idea came because I found the contractor's name in the War Grave Commission archives and identified the builder, and I felt that it's important because it's something that often gets missed in the recollection of architectural history. The people who actually built it, the hands, the hidden hands, so to speak, and the builder is the significant one in that. So I wanted to find out more about Ho Bok Ki, but I couldn't find anything through the local archive search until I realized, fortuitously, that if I could identify his name through Chinese character, I could then search through the Chinese language newspapers, which took me to some of the clan associations, including the Huiyan Association, where I was able to identify his name and what it meant, and then went and searched at the National Library, which opened up a whole new way of looking at how you understand this site, because the Nanyang Xiangbao newspaper actually had a full-page spread, which I didn't show here this evening, but they were one of the few newspapers to actually give it such extensive coverage, which often gets missed because there's always that saying, oh, the local Chinese have not really taken to this site, but they did. They covered it. They showed their own people laying wreaths because it was traumatic for all of them at the same time. And the memorial for the Chinese civilians had not come up at that stage. There wasn't one at that stage.
Thank you for that. I think this one, this aspect of research depends so much on, well, in some way chance, and being able to access newspaper archives, which are, I would say, very hard to conserve and even harder to go through unless they're digitized. So perhaps I would say that your timing was quite right in the sense that we had been able to invest in the digitization of our Chinese papers in the past decade. Let's see, do I have anything online? Ian, thank you so much. 1970 and last year. Do come back and perhaps we can all go up together to Kranji, which is always such a beautiful and meaningful site. Yeah. Did you have any other unexpected surprises in the course of your research into this project, yeah, in the past years?
I think the biggest surprise was finding out that the architect was really not known at the commission itself. I think he was the principal architect for Asia, but he came from an average middle-class family, and his upbringing was in a way standard for a lot of young architects at the time. But because he didn't come from a background of privilege like the established architects that were working for the commission at the time, and because I guess there was a growing tiredness by the 50s of the whole endeavor, you know, after the war, somehow he just got completely missed. And it was only through exploring him that I was able to piece together a bigger story, because his role in it is a role that connects Kranji to the other sites throughout Asia, from Thailand, Burma, into northern India, and then of course into Hong Kong. He creates this link, and it was such a fascinating story, because he was also a veteran of the war, and you could just, when you read between the lines, you could see how it affects them and how it affects their design, especially when they're designing for their own fallen comrades. I think the other thing that really surprised me was how many connections this one particular site has to so many different elements of Singapore's history, through the other burial sites, through the incidents that shaped it during those war years and thereafter, and what it offers. And I think watching, I was there. I was in Singapore in November of last year to attend the Remembrance Day ceremony. It was the first one where there was full attendance from over the years of COVID, and it was such a remarkable feeling that everybody was there, and it offered something special. It was really quite a special place.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. I live in Singapore, and I'm Irish, so I follow a lot of the Irish situation. It's just something I'd like to mention. In the photograph that you see now on the left-hand side, there's kind of a semicircle. And in that section, through my research with the Irish, there is some from the First World War, as in the Indian Mutiny. One of them is actually an Irish guy. That's why I found out that section. And they were originally buried in Bidadari. So they ended up being disinterred and reburied there. So as well as that, I noticed there that there were at least 3 Germans from First World War who had been POWs. Was there any, apart from the Japanese cemetery, war cemetery that's here, is there any record at all of other like Germans or non-combatants or who were buried in Singapore that you know of? Who would have been like internees or POWs?
There were a lot. The most commonly found places were in Ulu Pandan and the Pasir Panjang cemetery, Pasir Panjang, which was the former Dover Road. They were the 2 primary places that were taking military burials continuously because of their association to army camps, or the British army camps at the time. But one of the things that we found was that there were a lot of individual graves marked all over the place in Bidadari. And that was the one that was more crucial, because it's actually identified at the War Graves Commission. They had an eye. They were constantly visiting every couple of years and checking on the graves in Bidadari. So, but which we all lament today, because all of these sites are disappearing.
It's true. I remember when I first came in the 1990s, we would see a very overgrown cemetery area, and there would be a notice, a very dilapidated notice saying emergency war cemetery. A lot of those have been exhumed. Though I take it that's amongst the group that you showed earlier on, along with Bukit Brown and some of the other big dead areas, so other cemeteries. Is there a record of those, do you know?
No, I don't think there is a definitive record. There were others that were discovered, for example, when the 8th Division, I think it was the 8th Division, the Australian 8th Division hospital was moving across the island following the line of the battle. They would set up their own little burial places as they went. And there was one that was identified near Marine Parade at the back of I think it was called St. Patrick's School. It was on the grounds of the former St. Patrick's School, not where the main campus is, but just before it. So these all were consolidated because the first thing that happened, and this happened through the Army graves registration units, not the commission itself, the Australian and British graves registration units that were stationed there, they would get a lot of information from the locals as to where these sites were. And a lot of the officers who were prisoners of war kept records of where they had buried their men across the island. There were hundreds. And even today, there are historians and battlefield archaeologists who are still planning to investigate sites where there might still be remains.
That's interesting, because I know St. Patrick's School was Australian. The Australian Army took it over as hospitals, and it never actually occurred to me, of course, there would be burials around that area. So that's yeah, very good to have that connection suddenly that I hadn't realized before. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe we have a question from Rowena, and I can read it out. It's, please, could you expand on how Colin St. Clair Oak's experience of war affected his designs and interaction with the CWGC?
Let's have a look, expand. Well, I'm still working through this myself to understand how it affects him, and that's actually a much bigger project that I've been working on for a couple of years now, because and not looking at just him, but there's a couple of other architects that also served overseas or served during the war and came back and did work for the War Graves Unit, including one for the Australian War Graves Services. My feeling is that, and the commission was quite clear at the beginning in their advice on who gets to design war cemeteries, where they preferred the architects to have served, and they had on the rationale that they would be far more sensitive and less prone to frivolous decorative designing, because it had to be timeless and because it was people that they were most likely to know, or their colleagues and comrades. So there was a certain level of austerity. In the case of Colin St. Clair Oakes, he was also the first modernist to do work, and he was crossing the boundary, so to speak, from the established order that the War Graves Commission had been used to in the past and was still being used to, especially in the European theatre. So all his sites from Kohima through to Thailand, including Saigon in Hong Kong, there is a level of modernism to that. He was able to take his experiences, which were really developed in the 1930s as a practicing architect, and carry them through sensitively, but without adornment. I didn't show it this evening because it really is, it sort of digresses to a more architectural discussion. His earlier schemes that he had done for Kohima, and where he actually had designed a pantheon on top of the hill, and it was more a triumphalist kind of structure, which probably wasn't the right thing, and it was rightly not allowed to proceed. So the idea of monument, memorial, it's a very delicate balance as to what to put, where to put, and how to design them without them being overtly symbolic, if that's the right word. I think that's about as much as I can explain it at the moment without having more drawings to show you.
I think perhaps we should have another talk based on those drawings, because we are talking about architecture as well, and such a rich subject. Perhaps we should explore it further.
If I may, I'll just add to the British listeners this evening. Oakes by 1954 had actually changed job and had taken up the position as the chief architect for the Boots pharmaceutical company. And I think you will all know, you're all aware of Boots Pharmaceuticals, and he was responsible over the next 15, 16 years for designing and getting built hundreds of their high street stores across the UK that had been destroyed during the bombings. And I think they portray a very different type of modernism, which was pretty much the standard at the time, which is a good reflection of how his work evolved from Wargrave's work to mainstream commercial architecture work. And I think today, some of them, or a lot of them, are starting to be redeveloped or redesigned into more contemporary versions. So if you do come across one that still has its original design, you'll know exactly what it is.
Thanks for that one. We'll be keeping our eyes peeled for the next Boots pharmacy that we are looking at in the UK. I'm looking up at the chat group, the chat box, and Sarah actually had this other question, which was about, are there any other cemeteries where there's such a device, design device of aircraft, or perhaps any other particular representation of one of the services?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Each cemetery is different, and each one is designed to reflect both its location, its topography, its landscape, the design template that the commission gives the architects that they tend to follow to some extent. But each one also is quite evocative. There are quite a few, in particular from what I understand, on the Western Front, which are designed to represent the type of casualty that created so many of the people of the deaths that happened in the burial grounds. For example, there's a cemetery that resembles a crater of a shell that exploded. In the case of Kohima, Oakes had actually gone there in 1945, soon after the end of the war, and had retained the old tennis court that was on top of the hill where the Battle of Kohima occurred, which was the tennis court of the Deputy British Commissioner to Kohima. And he integrates the tennis court within the design of the cemetery and places the shrine, the cross of sacrifice, on top of the tennis court to reflect the nature of what was there prior, which I think in one of my pictures earlier, which showed it, you could catch a glimpse of that.
Thanks for sharing that. We are coming up to the hour, so may I ask if there are any additional questions or comments for our speaker this evening? This is your chance. Well, okay, I think everyone's very happy with your sharing and not much questions. Well, I would say that do buy the book, if I may say so, and there's much more in there. But I would say that in an era of at the moment where we are, I guess climate crisis and the issue of development and architecture and building. One thing I've taken away from your research and your sharings, how do we treat the question of time and construction? How do you design in a way that is timeless and therefore a way for every generation to connect with a building, a site? Yeah, and that's something to think about. It's not really something we are taught in school. So, well, thank you very much, everybody from across the Commonwealth and beyond, joining us this evening in Singapore and Australia. And thank you to our hosts in London, Megan, for helping us get this going. I'm so glad that we had a chance to meet over the internet. Technology is so wonderful. And I look forward to seeing everyone again on this forum at our future talks. The CHF really appreciates everyone's interest and support for our joint endeavor to use heritage to bring all of us together closer. Thank you, everyone, again. And good night from Singapore.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.